Hey everybody, Steven here, 40 plus BJJ. This is my group for those of you who aren't familiar. So we had another couple of questions come up in the group today about strength in Jiu-Jitsu. And although I've written and done other videos on this quite a few times, I feel it's really important to revisit this for a number of reasons. Number one, we have people who are entering the conversation at different levels in their Jiu-Jitsu experience and development in their thinking. Number two, there are new people simply coming into the group all the time, or people who may have been in the group, but frankly have just been very casual. They haven't really delved into the resources or looked deeply at the philosophy, in those resources that, I provided for many years. But others of you, I really want to put a little pressure on, and not to diminish you or make you feel defensive, but just to challenge you critically, because look, although jiu-jitsu is a physical activity, make no mistake, there are errors in critical thinking that I see people repeating over and over again, even when they have had solid rationale or evidence presented to the contrary. And it becomes like a meme, like a brain, not a social media meme, but like in the biological sense of like a kind of like a brain virus where people just sort of repeat this. And the reason why they do that from a thought perspective is it comes down to the difference of thinking from first principles, like core fundamental principles at the root, versus reasoning by analogy. And most people are conditioned to think by reasoning by analogy. They can be very, very smart. We all have a tendency to think that way. It's very difficult actually to think from first principles, especially to do it all the time. It's like an ongoing training, a muscle you have to develop in your brain over time. And we can all fall short of it, which is why, looking at things critically can be important, because it can help on an area that we're focusing on and really putting some time and energy into it to really think about it better and then be able to ultimately perform better in any area of our lives. So it's useful. I actually did a video and I was using as an example the arm triangle, because there was a whole thread about the arm triangle. I did a video on first principles versus reasoning by analogy thinking with a particular technique as an example, because so many people were just throwing in their favorite way to do an arm triangle. And my point was to give an example of how you actually approach it, not by reasoning by analogy, something you've heard, something you've successfully done, this is how I do it. But if your guiding star, right, is always the optimal balance of efficiency and effectiveness, which in jiu-jitsu it should be, of course, then there will be better ways to do it. It's not a matter of fucking opinion, right? There's simply an objective material reality going to be a better way to do it. Are you willing, as a critical thinker and thinking from first principles, to see a better way to do it, understand why from first principles, and then abandon the previous reasoning by analogy strategy, even if it was successful for you, because you know the other way is better and more efficient? That's the challenge, right? So this is something that's going to be maybe a challenge for some of you. I'm going to go through the thread. We had a couple of them today, but I'm going to go through the one that was specifically on a great question by Robert Parson. And I'm going to address some of the responses and kind of categorize the responses. So again, I know some people, no attention span, you won't bother to even watch this whole thing. That's on you. But if jiu-jitsu is important to you and you don't want to just be the person that just says, well, that's what I think and I'm sticking to it, I'm going to go in my corner and just continue to repeat the same mistakes over and over again, that's cool. If you're interested, you'll actually check this out. So Robert asks, help me to understand something. I constantly see people talking about how you should not use your strength when training. I say, why not? Should you not use the tools that are in your toolbox? You never hear people saying, don't use your quickness or don't use your flexibility. Why is quickness and flexibility always acceptable, but strength is not? I'm neither quick nor flexible. Why should I not be able to use my strength? I worked hard for it. And he threw in a couple other pieces too down in the comments, which are very, very good follow-ups along, this rationale. Somebody had mentioned, strength fades over time. And he said, well, flexibility and speed also fade over time though. True. He also said, would it be wrong to ask my lighter and quicker training partners to not use their quickness? Okay, so that's to frame this whole conversation. By the way, just as an aside, in my academy, and I know I'm not alone, I also discourage reliance on other physical attributes like explosive speed and flexibility. Um, Now, I don't, again, we'll be talking about this, not necessarily for competition, not even for developing skills that are to be used in competition when you're executing a particular A-game strategy at this particular time in your jiu-jitsu development. But long term and as core first principles in your training fundamentals, I discourage it and want people to minimally rely on those. So it's not just a strength conversation, but let me go on. So again, I did this video on the first principles. And by the way, one of the greatest examples, and I've seen other people cite this same video, there's a very brief video I'll attach for you from Elon Musk, a very quick interview snippet where he talks about this exact thing. You know, he's very high level with this. You know, he can think on first principles and just simply do things. And I mentioned this in the video, right? On a level that, you know, most of us, you know, can only dream about. It's Tony Stark shit. But all of us can take what he's talking about into any endeavor that we put time and energy into. So I'll include that as well. It's worth the watch. All right. So when I did that video, by the way, on how to apply first principles thinking versus reasoning by analogy to your jiu-jitsu, the stupidest comment I got, and again, I'm usually trying to be very tactful, but come on, man, was basically, you know, I'm not here to think, I'm here to train. Ooh, macho, right? So, you know, ironically, based on the subject of the video, that was a reasoning by analogy statement. But, you know, as though the two things, thinking and practice, like actual physical training and everything, were mutually exclusive. This fucking asinine, right? Because it shows a complete unawareness or repudiation of critical thinking and positive feedback loops, which, by the way, are at the core of every combat, I mean, any sport in general, but like any combat application from combat sports all the way through to military warfare where, you know, it's about, you know, killing the enemy. Like, it's just core fundamental, right? And so to think that those two are mutually exclusive or to assert that is absurd. So anyway, what always complicates first principles approaches are other related logical fallacies, like reasoning from authority or confirmation bias. So for example, you know, well, so-and-so is a respected authority, you know, high-level notable instructor, high-level, you know, competitor, trainer, and they said this one time, and that seems to run counter to your argument. So therefore, I'm going to assume that they're right and work backwards from there to make sure that I always assert that they're right. And we'll see evidence of this as well. Okay. And the other thing I'll say before I get into some of the comments and addressing the different categories of argument here is that a lot of the confusion, as I've talked about before, on this topic of use of physical attributes, specifically strength, is really just a confusion of context, because there's a very important difference between that conversation when it comes to regular day-to-day training, you know, in your academy with your training partners for skill development, and when you're training for competition or a competitive career, or even one single tournament, right? If you're prepping for that, it is a different conversation about where strength, explosiveness, flexibility, all those things fit into the equation. It is a different conversation. The problem is that a lot of times when you hear these conversations, people are conflating those different contexts as though they're all kind of one lump sum universal discussion, or they may have heard, you know, coming back to argument from authority, they may have heard a senior student that they look up to, a competitor, an instructor, say something about strength in the context of competition, and then they have then extrapolated from that authority in their mind was using that as a general statement, but to give that authority figure some benefit of the doubt, they may not have meant that whatsoever. They may have been very specific to the competitive environment. So let me go through the categories here in some of the comments. So reasoning by analogy, argument number one is strength matters. And this one goes something like, Ted said, if strength didn't matter, there wouldn't be weight classes. Hear this all the time. And the main line of thought is, all other things being equal, I don't care what anybody says, strength matters. The stronger guy, all other things being equal, skill, experience, all that, technique, then the stronger guy, has the advantage. Yep. So again, I don't mean this in a derogatory way whatsoever. We're kind of being lighthearted here, but I'm going to be honest. This is a perfect example of a no shit statement, right? Because look, ask yourself this. If that weren't the case, would we even have evolved Jiu-Jitsu? Would human beings have Jiu-Jitsu, specifically the system that we refer to as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because of where it evolved, right? Would we have that system of physics, applied physics called Jiu-Jitsu? Would we even be talking about technique? It's the reason why the fucking thing came into being in the first place is because the physical attributes matter. The issue is about solving the problem of physical attributes. Okay, but it is, of course, a real thing. Nobody ever said it wasn't. That isn't the point. Okay, and then we had somebody like Roger said, you can use strength. People who say you can are weak pussies who don't like losing. I mean, this is right up there with I'm not here to think, I'm here to train. Come on, man. Like, it's such an immature perspective. It's ridiculous. And I can tell you without exception that every single person who is very, very high level of technique, like where you talk about people you work with who are either top 1% of practitioner at one point in time, because nobody stays on top forever, in a competitive sense, and then top 1% of people who are able to like pass on jiu-jitsu effectively to others. Anybody who fits that category, they never, ever fucking talk like that. Like, it's stupid. So don't be that guy. Reasoning by analogy, argument number two, just use the attributes you have. So there's a few examples of this coming up. And so we had Scott, use the attributes you have. We have to learn to problem solve, and someone being stronger, more flexible, etc. than you is a problem that you need to solve using your technique and physical attributes. There's a point there. John, if the fat guy is using his weight and the quick guy is using his speed, then use your strength. Well, fat guys use that particular superpower, so I'm going to use strength while I have it. And sometimes you have to use your strength. I often use it against bigger guys when my technique is good. Alan, I'd say do use your strength, but know when to use it. Use your strength, use your weight, use your pressure. This is Reed. Everybody's path is different. Would you tell a smaller, quick, fast guy to slow down? Use what you got, but try to learn how to use your technique with your strength, okay? So-so, right? So-so. So more reasoning by analogy, but at least there are good critical thoughts kind of creeping in there, right? Like it's not, this isn't like a lost cause perspective. Let's address it. So the thing is, what I like that Scott said is that you have to, like, if this is a problem, why not present it to your training partners and make them have to adapt? So that part I like, Scott, because if you only had people, like, this is why we talk about the difference between a particular mode. Again, it comes down to semantics sometimes, but some people get very gimmicky when they talk about flow rolling, and that makes the people who think and correctly recognize that it's gimmicky go, that's bullshit. That's not how it is in real life. So we roll hard, right? But the middle ground is a non-attribute based roll that's still competitive and not gimmicky. And we call that advanced rolling. I have a video on that as well, how to actually do that But again, it comes down to semantics, because somebody may say flow rolling and they may actually mean what we're talking about by quote unquote advanced rolling. But other people say flow rolling and you just look at it and it's just silly, flowery, abstract nonsense, right? So, but it's the bare minimum of reliance on physical attributes. So strength, yes, but also, like I said, extreme flexibility, extreme explosive quickness, things like that. Um, Instead of quickness, we talk about, being as early as possible. Sometimes you need to be, a little quick just for a moment, but you're not being explosive. And there's a distinction there. You can have very strong structure that often gets misread by overuse of strength, and sometimes people themselves are not very good at knowing the difference, and they get a little irritated when people point out the difference, because sometimes those people are correct and some it's where does ego come in? Sometimes the people are correct, sometimes they're not correct, right? I've had students of mine who are ridiculously strong and I know they're overusing it, and they're like, no, I'm just using technique. I'm like, okay, you know better, right? Like, I can't tell the difference. But at the other hand, you see people that roll and they get the whole thing like, oh man, you're really strong, and all they're saying to their training partner is, oh, the only reason you got over on me is because you're really strong, when in fact the person may have just been, giving no space. And when you get good at thinking along these lines, as a coach, you can start to, as a third party, really assess that more correctly than, it takes people years of really paying attention to be able to discern what is overuse of strength and what isn't sometimes. I know it's nuanced, but anyway, I do like the fact, getting back to the point, that you correctly identified presenting that problem to people, because it is a problem. As I said before, we wouldn't have jiu-jitsu if it wasn't a problem, right? Bigger, stronger guy beating up the little guy or woman. So what we want to be able to do, again, is use technique to solve the problem, because you realize, and again, this comes back to sort of like, no shit, but also respectfully, first principles thought is that if we could solve the problem of physical attributes on the level of physical attributes, we would not have jiu-jitsu. So the answer is always going to rely in technique. And the point being, how much strength, how much explosiveness, how much flexibility, etc. do you use? The answer is always just enough. And I understand that that's subjective, and you may think that you're using just enough, but it's still too much. And you have to rely on, experience and really trying to be aware of that, or maybe somebody who is a smart coach that understands what I'm talking about as well, who can come in and help guide you, little minor adjustments and little recommendations along the way, and that will get better and better. And it gets more and more what? Fucking efficient, because jiu-jitsu isn't just about effectiveness. That's why if you're a blue belt and you're super athletic and you're already smashing all the other blue belts in your gym and you're tapping out half of the purple belts or more on a regular basis, and sometimes even catching a brown belt or something, and you're going in the locker room and saying, why the fuck isn't my coach made me a purple belt yet? I'm beating all these guys. Is because you're still too much of your athleticism has come into play. I could care less, right, if you are able to do that at this point in time, because it won't be forever, right? Talk to me in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? If you're still even on the mat. If you can do it where you're using a disproportionate amount of physical attributes to fill in the holes that you lack with your technique, and you're able to have the end result, which is like you can tap these people out or dominate them, positionally or something. If they're able to be able to play the game at, say, a purple belt level in all those different areas of the game, technically without the reliance on those attributes, right? Because what I do know is that at some point, even if you get over on them right now, if they keep training that way and you keep training your way, there'll be a point where that tide turns and you'll never get it back. Just always, right? So, so the good thing is though that there are times, like in comp team or at certain times, where you kind of mutually agree with training partners you trust, to now we're going to have like not just a competitive role, we're trying to get the submission, but we're going to use what we have, right? So if my training partner is 25 and he's super athletic and everything, as long as he's not trying to hurt me, we have these times where we kind of mutually we pick it up, and you have that real competitive, like we're in a tournament match, just to keep honest, because it is good sometimes to deal with that person who isn't trying to do an elbow escape when you're on mount or something, but is literally just trying to grab you and bridge as hard as they can and throw you off, and they can bench press 400 pounds, right? It's good to deal with that sometimes. But it's in terms of like everyday training that you should be relying on that. You should be the guy on bottom that just because you can, you should. No, man, your jiu-jitsu is going to suck. Because if your goal, again, is to have an optimum balance of effectiveness and efficiency, it's not just about the bottom line, it's about how you're effective, because that's going to be jiu-jitsu that will carry you for your entire career into your older years, and you won't have to reinvent your game. You'll continue to be able to build a game that can scale, meaning can get better over time, not diminish as your attributes deplete. If that's what's interesting to you, then you won't do that. You'll use just enough, right? Makes sense? You have to understand that there's a sliding scale, more reliance on physical attributes, less reliance on technique. You can't have it both ways, right? In other words, efficiency can never be optimized when you over-rely on your physical attributes. They are two different directions. And that's simply, again, a material reality. You can say, oh, I use my strength, but I work on my technique. See a lot of the sentiment here that I just read, right? And then you see, as a corollary to that, like sometimes you have to use your strength. I often use it against bigger guys when my technique is good. Okay, why do you have to sometimes? Because you're trying to win, right? So instead of always thinking about winning, think about solving the problem with technique, even if it means failing time and time again. Heron and Henner have a video out there where Henner's talking about, their principle is not new about, failing forward. And all that means is that failure is constitutive of building greatness. But you have to be willing, you have to be selfish enough for long-term gain, not short-term gratification, to be willing to get beaten and fail over and over and over again, whether it's in isolated positional sparring or in free rolling and things like that. You have to be willing to solve the problems on technique. Not say, okay, I did it well enough up to technique, but now that they're stronger than me and they're also skilled, so I can't use technique, now I'm going to use strength. It doesn't make sense. They already have you beaten there. So don't continue to try and solve the problem in technique. It just means you're not there yet. But if efficiency and effectiveness are both important to you, then you will try and continue to fail until you can solve it on technique. Make sense? All right, reasoning by analogy number 3. Use it, just don't rely on it. So we had Tom says, use your strength, make them adapt. Okay, like I said, there's something to that, but she'll still should not be leaning on it, right? There's times where you have to say, especially if you have, say, a training partner is preparing for a competition, whether you're preparing for that competition or not, even if you're a non-competitor, but you're going to train, sometimes they're not the strongest guy. I'm a strong guy. In this role, I'm going to be like a tournament. I'm going to prep them for that tournament. They need to learn how to not just have technical finesse, but they need to have people really strong trying to put it on them, because I know they're going to be outmatched in strength by some of the people in their division, right? Yeah, great. So, but not as a regular habit. Ian, nothing wrong with strength, just don't rely on it. Like I said, there's a sliding scale there. You can't have it both ways, okay, in training. And it's not sustainable. It will deplete over time. By the way, I've talked about this a lot too. But one of the common things I hear, again, it's another meme that you just hear kind of repeated because it sounds good, sounds like something else somebody said that sounded like a good thing to quote, is, old man strength, right? I just crush those guys with my old man strength. And sometimes, because I know, like a couple people in particular, even one guy in particular would call him the legend, right? Former power lifter, great guy, and technical, but, you know, just so fucking strong. Like literally, if he puts you in a headlock and you know all your headlock escapes, right? Typically a fairly easy position to get out of. I'm not talking about scarf hold either. I'm talking about just a headlock. I mean, you realize that if you don't create proper connection into his body, even if you're already on your side, he could this is a guy who like put you in a headlock. He could drive into you, flatten you back out, pop your vertebrae with his weight and pressure, and probably like break your neck just by cranking on it. You know, like just amazingly strong. You know, one of these guys that crack acorns between his fingers type of thing. And again, it wasn't just that he was strong, he was also technical, but his strength is ridiculous. You will never solve that problem trying to use strength, like trying to say, well, you know, look, I use 70% technique, but I use 30% strength. Like, well, your 30% strength is fucking meaningless with him. Like, you have to be using proper technique earlier with better awareness, better connection if you want to be able to solve that problem, period. Right? So it's the only way to go about it. So that, again, it sounds good, but there's a little bit of a hole there. And also they kind of have a one-off here statement about want to slow down a bigger or strong person, get good at lasso guard. Now, on any given comment, any given thread, somebody will say half guard, somebody will say spider guard, somebody will say close guard, whatever. Look, you could be the best guy or woman to ever do jiu-jitsu in recorded history and never play lasso guard. Because this is reason by analogy. Like, I always will encourage you in this group, any other group, YouTube comments, whatever the fuck, don't listen to people who give you individualized advice. XYZ works for them. There's very few conditions where that's okay, right? If you have very similar personality, very similar body type, very similar established style of play, there's something there. But in most cases, people are just saying, well, this is what I do, you know, or my instructor does this and that's how he keeps or she keeps big, strong people off. No, it's like, you know, that might not work for everybody, right? That's not their movement patterns. That's not how their brain works. So disregard, okay? And then we have, just kind of wrapping up here, closing in on the end, we have reasoning from authority argument related. And, you know, Xandro writes, it's simple. If you don't gas after just a couple rolls, you're not using a lot of strength, regardless of what your rolling partner tells you. That sometimes is true. I'm naturally strong. When I started training, a few people told me that, but I didn't feel like I was using too much strength. But being new, I didn't know any better, so I thought I might be. But strength is relative. What feels strong to somebody might just be normal to another person. There, as I mentioned, is some truth to that because people could misread it. All right, but let's continue. Just look at the people on top, even at the lighter divisions. They are straight up jacked. Mendes brothers, Cobrinha, and yes, even Marcelo Garcia, as strong as an ox he is. Also, BJ Penn attributes his success in jiu-jitsu to his strength and flexibility. And then he says, this is my favorite video on the topic. And he shows a video by Bernardo Faria. And in the video, just to summarize, you can look it up, but if you look at it, Bernardo says, if you're using strength and not getting tired, you should use strength. And he says the same thing as Xandro. Like, he talks about, you know, people saying he was using too much strength. And then one of his instructors early on, basically said, you know, are you getting tired? And he goes, no, I can keep that pace up. And the guy said, then keep using your strength. And so Bernardo then kind of goes on and says, like, you know, jiu-jitsu's developing technique and strength. And he says, this is a very important message I received in the beginning of my career. Context. Career, competitive, right? Starting off with moving into competition, having a run at being a young adult division competitor, winning very impressively, you know, I believe 5-time, you know, world champion, 1GL's champion. Bernard is a friend of mine. I very high respect for him and what he's accomplished. But you have to take the context into play, right? Because the thing is, there are different levels of, you know, it's not just about the blowing your wad use of strength, right? Some people are naturally strong. They have more muscle fibers, as Robert or one of the people said, you're talking about like farmer strength, um, and we all know what that feels like. They might not move the most in the weight room. They might not, snatch the most over their head, but goddamn, when they grab you, it's like, even if you're pulling with both hands and kicking your leg in the other direction, you can't even break the grip they have on your leg. And so some people have that. But again, just because you have the ability to sustain that muscular endurance and use of strength now, right? You're talking about somebody in their 20s and 30s. Are you executing a game from the perspective of first principles in jiu-jitsu, not a short-term competitive career, what you're trying to optimize for right now? But if your interest is in optimizing for efficient / effective jiu-jitsu long-term, like my goal is, like a lot of the people in this group's goal is, but they're confused, right? Because my goal is to do jiu-jitsu, my ultimate goal, to do jiu-jitsu as long as I can, so that basically, the day that I don't do jiu-jitsu again is going to be a sad day, because minus illness or accident or something like that, I'll live long, and you have to remove me from the mat when basically I can't move anymore and I'm shitting my diapers, right? Like at that point, okay, sad day, but I'm going to do it as long as I can. So, and I've had a number of significant injuries along the way, so I'm optimizing for that. And minus whatever goal you have in jiu-jitsu, that should to some level be everybody's long-term goal. Because I've seen far too many people that are the jiu-jitsu equivalent of the star athlete in high school, like the captain of the football team, looking back on their glory days all banged up with a beer gut, going like, yeah, I used to be great, back then. But like, they didn't optimize for long term. They were just kind of short term, and then their body couldn't keep up. They burned out. And then they're kind of like a shadow of their former self, reminiscing their glory years. Fuck that. I don't want to be that guy. Okay. I want to enjoy this long term. I want to help other people enjoy it long term. That's why I'm doing this, taking my time out of my day to do this. Do some coaching, and hope this sinks in, right? So, I'd mentioned this before, Zandro. That's why, I pick on you just a little bit, because I already pointed out to you this is reasoning but from authority. The thing is, and so not only am I a big Bernardo fan, I'm pointing out the context of that, but I'm also a huge BJ Penn fan, very, very highly regarded. But again, BJ's technique is ridiculous, and yes, he's very strong for his size and build, and ridiculously flexible, and he used those competitively in his career. But you're talking about a guy who very quickly ascended, won the world championships in jiu-jitsu, and went immediately into a long career in MMA, like a competitive guy. Is this who you're modeling, this after? And just because he attributes his skill level during his career, competitive career, to strength and flexibility being layered on top of his technique, is that what you want to emulate? And if BJ's only skill sets are built around being really strong with his grips and being really flexible, then what do you think is going to happen when BJ no longer can just swing his head unassisted behind his back and pummel it in between you when you think you have chest-to-chest connection to him from side control, right? And all of a sudden there's his foot, and you're like, wait a second, how did he get his guard back? I was just laying on his chest, right? Is that the game you want to emulate? Right? It doesn't make any sense. This is why, number one, sometimes people who are extremely good aren't the best gauges of what makes things successful. For instance, right? What if you had the same argument from Muhammad Ali or Roy Jones Jr., Lomachenko for boxing? Okay. If you took their advice on what do they think their main secrets to success was at the highest levels, right? Is that, I think what really allowed me to become successful is that, you know, a lot of people talk about the fundamentals, like first principles of having a good defensive structure where you actually have your chin down for biomechanical reasons that lend itself both to defensive and offensive structures at this particular range, and keeping their hands up in a defensive posture, and some other things, related to stance and all that stuff, and mobility. And instead, right, I chose to fight with my hands down next to my side and use a lot of head movement and footwork. A lot of guys, I practiced that a lot, and I kind of had this type of coordination that lended itself, and I can move this way. That was the secret to my success, because I was playing a game that's like very hard for people to emulate at that level. So they would come in and they just, even if they had people try, they couldn't deal with me and how I move. They hadn't experienced my movement patterns till they faced me in the ring. Great. Absolutely true. Those things are all true. But if you then try and extrapolate that that's what you should do, you know what you're going to have if you're not a 1 in a million athlete like those guys, because they're a rarity even in the highest level professional boxing in the world. You're going to have brain damage, dude. Serious brain damage. Okay, so just because somebody said it doesn't mean that's where you should be taking your cues from, right? Because again, reasoning by analogy / reasoning from authority, you're not thinking from first principles. I would not be emulating that advice. All right. And again, that goes for one of the guys, screen name Product Andrew. If you think you are late, if you're late, you use strength. If you use strength, you get tired. If you tire, you die. Quote from Saulo Ribeiro. Really good quote. But again, Xandro's citing of what Bernardo said would almost be like the counter to that. So I'm trying to get you guys to think even beyond the fatigue aspect, just to the efficiency optimization aspect. Now, in terms of first principles, on the other hand, we have some people that have come much closer to that. And this is what I'll wrap up with. Glenn. Now, Glenn is a friend of mine, but I'm not quoting him because he's a friend, because I have lots of friends that I think, maybe in jiu-jitsu, maybe gesturing a little bit too close to reasoning by analogy when it comes to their thinking, even if they're very good. Glenn is not one of those guys. Like, he's a very first principles thinker. When he's talking, or Henry or anything like that in here, you pay attention. And I don't say that from reasoning from authority, for the same reason that I don't. I cite Hickson all the time, and I don't do that because he's Hickson Gracie. Therefore, I must listen to him because everything out of his mouth is true. Because Hickson could say something and I'd be like, well, but that doesn't follow from first principles. So although you're the fucking man, dude, I would still disagree with the conclusions he came to, right? But the thing that makes Hickson so great, in my estimation, wasn't just how proficient he was. It's how, although he was a fine-tuned machine physically during his peak years, when he was the family champion and was poised at all times to defend the family honor and take challenge fights and all that stuff. The reason why I cite Hickson so much isn't out of reasoning from authority. It's because he so consistently hit the nail on the head from first principles to a greater degree than I believe anybody in the history of jiu-jitsu has. And then was able to actually express those. So, what he was able to come up with by taking all the primary positions and techniques in jiu-jitsu and really give the gift of this thing called connection, which is somewhat contextual of what it means in all these different areas. But he was able to give us connection. Very misunderstood thing. Is like, it's like speaking a language within the language of jiu-jitsu, and a lot of people think they're doing connection and they're not. And it was a major evolution for me to see, and it's ongoing, right? But to see where some areas I was getting it right and other areas I was missing the mark, and just a little tweak, and now one small detail changes everything, you know. But again, it's kind of contextual. You have to learn how to extrapolate that principle in different ways in different types of situations, um, to be able to start to then understand connection in places that nobody showed you connection, right? That like, and get it right. But he gave that gift to jiu-jitsu, which is by definition, by default, first principles. So although he was very physically strong and had amazing cardio and everything, especially back, you know, in his 20s through, you know, mid 40s or whatever, he didn't need to rely on that, and he would routinely beat the best guys he rolled with who were actively competing, bigger than him, training in, you know, pressure cooker environments with other guys who were essentially professional athletes for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he would just dismantle them. Like, the only way you could do that wasn't on physicality, right? It was on a level of technique that was just in a different playing field. So, you know, basically a different operating system. So what Glenn wrote was, you know, the answer to this problem about strength is, what's your objective? Is your objective during practice to get stronger or to become more efficient? It's not really a question of not using your strength. The statement usually relates to people who roll like it's the end of the world every single time. It's poorly worded, like when you read, leave your ego at the door. My main objective now is to make my breathing more efficient during rolls. This tends to take care of the outcomes better than anything. Listen to that. That may sound, if you're doing reasoning by analogy, to mean the same as, well, he said, it's not really a question of not using your strength. Therefore, he must mean the same thing as the people who say, use your strength as much as you want, just don't rely on it. It's a little bit different, because what he's talking about is not just, can I be really strong in my role and not get tired when I'm 30? It's not the point, right? The point is optimizing for efficiency. So listen to what he said, right? And Glenn's actually done something that I'm, you know, super interested in doing. Is, you know, he took the breathing course and got a certification on the same breathing technique that Hickson's famous for. You know, if you go watch Choke and all that stuff, with a really good teacher. And you know, he did that, and something I've been very interested in doing myself, because I've always been fascinated with the power of breathing and diaphragmatic breathing and all of its potential. So, you know, I've given this advice. I just haven't been to this level of the breathing training as Glenn. But when he says, you know, what my goal is during the roll is not to win, it's to focus on the efficiency of my breath. The outcomes take care of themselves, right? Really understand what that means from a first principles perspective, rather than thinking that that sounds like something else that you've said or heard, and understand the difference, because there is a significant difference there. It's nuanced, but there's a significant difference. And then finally, you know, we have Ian, who also, I think, you know, really gestured towards hitting the nail on the head, where he says, you know, now using pressure, that's a whole different ball game. Use it, smother your foe and watch the life drain from their eyes, make them take the pressure and carry your man flesh until their bones grind to dust and their skin is flattened to the mat like a freshly poured crepe. Poetic. So that's badass, funny, right? But it's true. Now the thing is, a lot of times, again, we get nuanced with semantics, because one person's pressure game is another person's grip strength and squeeze. And that's not it, you know. Taking the cue from Hickson Jiu-Jitsu, and somebody who just uses their weight properly and in the right place with total relaxation, and minimal contact with the mat, maximum contact with their opponent, again in the right place. That is pressure. And holy shit, right? The amount of, with the same body and same amount of number of techniques, you know, or whatever, just being able to optimize for that shift to proper weight placement is like a night and day transformation. And sometimes it's just a matter of, like, once you speak the language a little bit, just a matter of like feeling it and then going like, okay, and then kind of testing it out. And it's not a matter of accumulating a new skill so much as it is of erosion and stripping away excess of things that you were doing that you weren't even unconscious you were doing, like places you were putting your weight on the mat, places you were relying on a grip. You simply didn't need to. And all of a sudden, it takes you a little bit to release your dependence on those elements, but then you're noticing that your partners are like gasping, and when you feel that you're gasping, you're like having trouble keeping your breath, even if you're very used to heavy guys laying on you, and somebody much smaller who does that properly is just taking the life out of you, and you never feel like there's a spot where you can just lay there with your arms in and just recover, just relax, because they're draining life from you. And for the first time in X number of years, you're like, I'm going to pressure tap, right? It's phenomenal. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I want you guys to be interested in, because again, that's a game that you can optimize for longevity. Okay. Now, that being said, once again, so we're totally clear, if your objective is short-term gratification, more love to you, but it's not first principles thinking. If your objective is a competitive career, whether that's one tournament or like really, really trying to hit certain competitive goals, then I still say the majority of your training time, you don't rely on strength, because again, the keyword there is rely, and you use only just enough. It's the same thing in MMA competition, but once you get to competition, or for that matter, because jiu-jitsu's antecedents, of course, are in self-defense and fighting. If you're in a fight, if you're big and strong and you have optimized for efficiency plus effectiveness, not effectiveness with efficiency being secondary, then use whatever you have. If you're big and strong, somebody's trying to hurt you and you can like grab their head and pluck it off their body, go ahead, use that too. You're going to go home, right? That's what I care about. If you're training for competition, then your first objective should be to win. Use what you have. But in training, not so much. Hope that makes sense, and I'll talk to you guys soon.